that should be fine. I think it's got a pretty good management. Okay. So a lot of you guys had some questions going over the layout stuff with CSS. We kind of went through it pretty quickly as far as what type of, do we use, floats or display inline block, or how do we achieve these more complex multi-column type layouts in CSS, and kind of when is the right time to reach for a certain tool. So I have a couple things that I'm going to show you, and then I kind of just want to take some general questions about that, because I used just this kind of very simple common 3-column layout that a lot of people like to do, with just header along the top, sidebar left, content, sidebar right, and footer as kind of an example of 3 different ways we could execute this. But I kind of also want to see maybe some things that you guys might want to achieve, some problems you've run into on your projects, stuff like that, and we can kind of work through those. So this is a layout that I put together, really, really simple as far as HTML. It's basically just a wrapper div that wraps around everything, a header, and then a container here. And in that container I have 3 sections, which are the navigation, this little sidebar here, the content, and then the sidebar right here. And then down below we have our footer. And that's all within that outer wrapper div. And you'll see here that in the CSS, the way that I've chosen to execute this, right now you can see it's a fixed width layout. So even though we have a big display here, I've fixed the width of the wrapper to 960 pixels, and then I've applied margin 0 auto, which is why it's sitting in the center here, and we have even margins on both sides. So that's kind of just a typical, you would see this type of a layout in about 2004, when screens were all desktops and they were all kind of one size or similar sizes. You would see a lot of people doing this, just make the site 960 pixels wide, fix it, and then to actually get the columns to arrange the way that we want, we would float them. Each section floats left, so this one floats left, this one floats left, this one floats left. And then we remember that applying the clear fix is what kind of prevents this little footer down here from, kind of coming up here and colliding with the content. So why would we do this? Why would we reach for float left here? There's a couple reasons, but the kind of biggest is just that it's the easiest tool to allow us to do this type of, I want to put this thing next to this thing next to this thing, and just have it all stack along the top line. This is versus another way that we could do this, which is, let's try actually changing this one right here so you guys can see what happens as I do it live. What if we were to say, rather than floating left, these things were display inline block? Theoretically, they're going to stay the same size, right? So theoretically, what display inline block should do is exactly the same as what the other one did. But as you'll see here when I refresh it, don't tell me I've lost internet now, I'll freak. But what it will actually do is something a little bit different. I'll pop over to this one for a second while that one's loading. This is one that I've done with display inline block. Sorry, is that a lie? Oh, this is my floating one. All right, well, this one I have a solution to. Since we're no longer tied to the internet, I am just going to make the network on the fly. Technology is killing me.
It's back. It's back.
Yeah, if that keeps giving us trouble, we'll just pop the network. So what happens if we do this? Should be more or less the same result. I'm just going to do that just to get us away from technology. It's just anything that comes from General Assembly that's currently cursed for whatever reason. I stole this cable from a display right out there. I hope no one was planning to use it. There we go. Good old cell phone. See, that's how we get internet now. So if we do display inline block, what's that? All of a sudden, our sidebar's gone. It's hanging down there. You'll see they're all still the right sizes. This one's 23% wide with a 2% margin. This one's 50% wide sitting in the middle, and that one's 23% wide with 2% margin sitting on the left, but it's not there. The problem with display inline block, or one of the problems with display inline block, is that you're saying literally these things sit in a line of text. So what that means is that if there's any space, physical, actual space characters, like, you know, these guys, in between them, it perceives that as taking up space. So watch what happens if I actually remove all the space between both the sections. See what I did there? I tucked those up, so there's physically no space in between them at all. Boom, now it works, just as we'd expect. But that's kind of a puzzling result, right? You don't want to be working on your website and have that happen. So we're doing some CSS layout stuff in here, and then John and Lisa are down the hall. John's going to be working on responsive stuff, and Lisa's doing some JavaScript stuff, but we'll all be here all night, so you know you won't miss anything. You know, if you want to go check out down there, come back, whatever you want to do. There's also several types of pizza and beer around.
Okay.
So that's kind of one puzzling thing about display inline block. The other thing that you can run into with inline block that's a little funky is sometimes you'll actually see one of these pieces of content go down here. And that has to do with your vertical alignment. So in text styling, sometimes you might want to vertical align all of your content on the baseline. It's called the bottom of your text. But if you do that, that actually will throw off your layout by moving blocks down here when you don't want them to be. So generally, those are the reasons that we reach for float. When we reach for float, what we're saying is, I don't care about I don't care about spaces or anything else between this. Basically, take these things out of the flow of the page completely and put them next to each other as we specify. So that just works. And this is when you look at how grid systems are put together, for instance, like these are layout systems put together by CSS masters, people who blow my mind. They all use this type of basic technique to achieve a really good grid layout. So in general, when you're doing your top level page layout, if it involves columns, you're going to want to reach for flow. Yeah.
So you mentioned that with inline block, it aligns at the bottom. Let's say we have a footer and we want that. Would you advise us to use inline block then in this case?
So,
or do we use float left and give it a define?
In this case, our footer on this type of a layout, are you saying if the footer spans 100% of the width, or if it's...
If you, let's say you have within the footer, you have maybe 3 little columns or little divs.
Sure.
Just like the middle part, but in the footer.
Sure, so what you could do is exactly the same thing, but rather than wrapping, here we've just happened to do 3 columns. Inside the content div here, we've put 3 sections, but we could actually just grab these 3 sections right here and just as easily pop them right into the footer. See that? And they're kind of floating outside there, so we need to add our clear fix in. But boom. So you can do it just as easily by putting it into the footer and using the footer as your main container. The thing to think about here is mainly just kind of being conscious of what's really happening here. This dark gray is one big container div. That's this. That's kind of saying this is our housing for this stuff. And we've put position relative on it, and we've also put clear fix on it to make sure that floating things don't fly outside of it. You can do the same exact thing with a footer, a header, anything. We've just happened to do it on this container div.
So, can you explain what container is?
A container is just something I made up. It's just a class.
Oh, I mean section. Sorry.
Section is just an HTML tag that, so there's a bunch of these. There's a bunch of tags that really have no inherent meaning to the browser or to anyone except you. It's just, there's like section, article, header, footer, aside. All of these are basically tags that don't have any special styling by default when they're rendered in the browser. It's more just so that you can name things in a distinct way that makes kind of hierarchy and makes sense to you when you go back and read it. So for instance, I like to do something like this where I kind of start with an outermost content level, content container, if you will, on the page, and then within it put each of the sections of types of content that I'm going to have on that page. So that's how I like to break it up. And then within those, you can have what's called articles. So within this content region, I might put like 3 article tags. But it's really, for all intents and purposes, just the same as putting 3 divs. It really is just all about your readability and perception. It also makes it a little nicer to just reach in with CSS. You see, we can just say section. You don't have to add a class to it.
Mm-hmm.
But then, of course, you have to be careful not to use section tags in a different, new way later on in your project. So it's kind of how you want to structure your HTML, how it makes sense to you. Does that make sense?
Would you, let's say you have this part, the navigation, content, sidebar, which you wrap, or you wrap these with a container. Let's say you have the same thing, again.
Mm-hmm.
Would you just call it section with another section with a different, just like copy paste this part?
So you're saying copy paste
Yes,
all of this, another 3-column layout
Yes.
beneath. So that actually is the container, just div class container. So we literally could just copy this and paste another one below. We wouldn't actually have to change anything.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There's 1, there's 2, and it just
Okay.
works.
Quick question, what if you want to scroll up a little?
Mhm.
What if you want it squared right there? Would you float that left, and if you did, would it try to go, where would it try to go?
Let's try to make that happen. That's a good question.
Because it would be on the bottom, it wouldn't be aligned to the top.
So if we were to add another section, let's just add another one called navigation. Let's say we have a navigation heavy site. What happens? So what it does is it more or less, it's kind of funny. I mean, this is another difference that will show you the difference in behavior between float left and display inline block. I'll change these to display inline block in a second. I'm just going to get rid of this extra stuff down here so we don't get too confused with what's going on. So I'll kind of show you why that happened or try to explain it. So the way float left does stuff, it's kind of going like this. It's like, okay, there's space for this thing, there's space for this thing, there's space for this thing. There's not space for this thing. How about here? How about here? How about here? Yep. It's kind of doing like a bin packing almost. It's not saying, whereas display inline block will do it a little differently.
Can I just say, in my head, I'm thinking that's like float right.
Right.
But that's like counterintuitive.
If we did float right, it wouldn't have, it'll do, I'll show you what it would do then. It would do something yet a little bit different. Oops. Type. Do it for a living. So, display inline block, oh yeah, we have our section column. Yeah.
But that doesn't happen with divs, right?
It does happen with divs.
Okay.
They actually behave exactly the same way.
It's the inline block.
Um,
It's not the name, it's the inline block.
so this is how display inline block is choosing to lay this out.
They're too wide to fit
They're too wide to fit.
for 960.
It's now, so only this thing can live in this column. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So as I layer things, even of different heights, if I use display inline block, it's basically saying this thing takes up as much width as it needs and as much height as the tallest thing in this row. So that means this. So it's actually saying this doesn't just take up this much space, this takes up all of this. And likewise, if we try to go over here, if we try to stack this, it's saying, you're right, nothing can, this can't fit in this column, so we're going to move it to a whole new line. And that, you can see again that different alignment behavior of how that starts right here. And you guys are going to, you guys are probably still looking at this to some level and hopefully understanding it a little bit better, but still a little baffled by what CSS is doing here. That's okay. Just go home and make 30 different layouts. I'm not saying tonight, don't do it all tonight, but over time, make some websites, play with this stuff, try display inline block, try float left, try whatever you want to try. It's not going to break anything except your website, and you can always put that back. So, just experiment, see what happens. You'll get much more familiarity with what kind of this stuff is really going to do in practice.
Brandon, the fourth block, the second navigation that you just added,
Yep.
it was squished to the other one because it didn't have the margin in between, right? That's why.
Yeah, it had a margin right, not a margin
Yeah.
left.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's space
Okay,
there. not
okay.
space there.
Right.
So would you always, if you work with margin, do you also apply margin right? Or margin left? What's better if you have several columns and you need a margin?
I'll show you my logic here of how I did it and my thinking behind it. This is not to say this is how everyone does it, but the way I've done it here is this is the CSS for the first column. I've chosen to do 23% width and a 2% margin on the right. So that's giving us this space. The content, I haven't put any margin on. And then the sidebar, I did 23% margin on, and 2% on the left. That's just the way I chose to do it. It would work exactly the same if I gave this content margin 2% on either side.
Oh, okay.
It's
Is
there's
there an
an
advantage or is it just
it's how you think of it. To me, there's an advantage to doing it this way, because when I was building those two columns, I was thinking, I want those to be identical in some way. And so I wanted to put not only the identical width, but the identical margin. As I'm saying that, it makes even less sense than it did to write it, and I could have just as easily put it on the content region, but it's just preference.
Okay.
For the most part, the only rule of thumb in CSS is do what works. If you're achieving the layout that you want, do what works. So, does anyone else have questions about this stuff before I
One
move
question
on?
on the best practice, if you scroll on the whole little side down the bottom right again.
Yep.
Would the best practice for that be create a container here and create a container there and then put
Exactly.
two blocks down?
Exactly.
And then
So-
float both of those to large containers. And put 2 blocks in there, 2 blocks in here.
Right. So within, if you wanted to make multiple rows within this
3.
column,
Yeah.
if you wanted to go boom, boom, boom down this column, you would put those within the sidebar, and you actually would need to float them because then you don't want them to sit next to each other. You want them to sit on top
Right.
of
No,
each
I
other.
meant you'd float this container and the sidebar, the
Right.
whole
Yep.
sidebar. Okay.
Exactly. So, in other words, if we wanted to do kind of what you're describing, what I would do would look like. I can't do my little expanding thing in here. That's right, I'm working in one, and then 2, 3, all the way down. And you could style those to just be however you want it. You could.
Set sidebar height to be even as
Yep. And if you wanted these to appear so that, for instance, they each had this light gray background rather than the light gray background being on the whole sidebar, you could do that as well. But you just so that's another thing to think about. Whenever you want to create columns within a row, or rows within a column, within a thing like this that's already floating, you generally need to insert a container. In this case, we need to insert a container this way to contain these three things and to also provide us with a clear fix so that these things don't float outside of their container. And in this case, we would use this as the container because, as we saw, if we tried to insert another fourth box, we'd get some kind of unwanted effects. So we basically want to start by building our, in a multi-column layout, we start by building our columns first. And those will pretty much span the whole length of the page as we want them, until we hit like another full width element. And then within those columns, we can use those individual columns as wrappers for new rows. So you can build as deep as you need to, and you can get pretty advanced with this stuff. Does anyone else?
Sorry, one more question. ClearFix, that's just for floats, right?
That is just for floats. So actually to use display inline block, some people recommend in certain situations using display inline block because you do get to avoid the whole clear fix thing.
Okay. And how is it working? Like if I imagine my screen and we've made the sections float,
Mm-hmm.
ClearFix is then looking at them, those things that are floating, and saying, how do I make sure that I surround them? Is that what it's doing?
Yeah, so more or less all it's actually doing in this case is this little after element, this colon after, basically says to the browser, put another thing, another virtual element, as if it were just an empty div, beneath whatever I put this class on.
Okay.
So in this case, what you can picture it doing is more or less as if we were to insert a secret little div down here that just didn't have anything in it. But we don't want to do that because that's ugly and we don't need to do that. So there's actually this kind of after thing in CSS that does that for us. Insert an element, another sort of element after whatever I put this class on. This is just saying it has no content. And then this display table is just to deal with some older browser issues. But the big meat of what ClearFix really does is actually just the clear both. And clear both does exactly what you just said, which basically says, look for anything that's floating to the left, look for anything that's floating to the right, clear that, and make a new baseline that's at the bottom of both of those so that any content from there on starts beneath that.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
So does ClearFix always have to be in next to the word or the container or the equivalent of container in the HTML?
It doesn't. So the only thing my container class here in this case is providing for us is just this dark gray background color and some padding on the top and bottom. I could just as easily remove that and it just will lose that styling, but the clear fix will still work. See? It's still clear, the footer still sits down here, it's just not pretty and gray. Well, it wasn't pretty, but it was not gray.
Okay.
Does that make some sense?
Yeah, and you put two classes together. You could put as many classes as you like.
Yeah, I could write forever.
Okay.
It just, it's the reason ClearFix is typically separated out is because it does one very specific thing, and it's kind of like painful to have to put that, like imagine otherwise to use ClearFix I'd have to do container, colon, after in those 3 lines, and then the next time I wanted to use ClearFix, whatever element, colon, after, so keep writing classes and classes and classes to do the same thing, so
Oh, okay.
that's kind of why we just separated it.
Could you, to be on the safe side, could you just apply ClearFix to the body and say,
It only works on the
I know.
element. Think about it this way as I drag this up a bit. ClearFix on this thing says, look for anything floating within this thing and clear it. This now defines the new bottom. So if we put it on the whole body, it would say anything that starts after the body starts on that new line. But nothing starts after the body because the body's the end of the document. Does that make, I'm trying to explain this so, we can watch what happens. It's kind of a weird thing to think about visually because there's really no explanation for what happens, but the answer is basically not much will happen. So in other words, it doesn't go deep. It doesn't say, look for any div within this that contains some floating things and make a new line at the bottom of it. It's basically just letting our footer do what it wants and slide up into here, and that's not good. But then, down here, technically, all by the end of our document, all floats are clear. But we can't tell that. So the answer is basically, you need to put it around on a direct container for each set of columns that you're building for it to work correctly.
Okay. So you have to use it on a container, not on the individual
Right, always on the
blocks.
container.
Okay.
What it's doing is looking for all the individual things within the container and finding the bottom point of those collectively and starting a new row, so to speak, after that. So, did you have a question?
I have a question about how to target two classes in CSS and why you would need to do that.
Targeting two classes
Like a lot
with
of
the same, writing the same set of styles, but applying it to two different classes.
yeah.
Sure. So there's, I'll show you first how to do it, and then I'll tell you why you might want to do it. So let's say we've decided, our designers just told us, I like your really boring gray there, but we want to make it a slightly lighter, maybe white. Okay. Well, we can do that with a couple classes. We know that one's already called navigation and one's already called content. That's how we write it. First class name, comma, second class. And we can use it just like
space, right?
just like anything else. Now they're white. So that actually kind of explains the why too. It's basically to target. We've said as a default, all sections, all three of these, get this background color here. And in this case, it would have actually made more sense to just target this one and make it that color and leave the other two their default, or set them to white. But doing it this way shows you how you could target two individually. And there's a lot of cases, once you have, let's say there were 20 of these, this would be, and we only wanted these two to be white, that would be a really nice way to do it. Does that make sense? Anything else?
You use percentages in your 3 columns.
Yep.
How vital is it that we add up to 100? Will it skew the whole page?
If you add up to slightly under 100, it's not vital at all. It's not a problem. But if you add up to 100.0000001, you got problems because your last column is going to go elsewhere. There's a few techniques out there to avoid that. One thing in the kind of helpful layout link that John put in the general Slack room earlier, you'll get to a point in there where it talks about box sizing. And box sizing is a really cool thing to learn about because basically what it says is when we start now, when we write a width on something, it says that just includes the actual content width. You'll see what happens. I'll demo this in a minute. That just basically means the content width is called the content box. The default value for the box sizing property is content box. That means that padding is in addition to that. And border is in addition to that. So if you apply padding or border, then you have to factor that in. If I wanted to add 20 pixels of side padding to each of these, it would throw my whole layout off because it's all based on percentages. So my options are then to set the padding in percentages, which I don't really want to do, or to set a pixel width on each of these things, which I don't want to do because I want it to potentially be fluid. Or I can manually futz with it until I figure out that if I leave a couple % off the width and add, this many pixels of padding, it kind of works. But then what about when it's a fluid layout and we're actually using those percentages to scale up really big or down really small? Then that, so what border box, which is the other value for box sizing, allows you to do is say, factor the padding in, factor the border into the size of the element so that it kind of like eliminates that whole pain point. So let's watch how that works. I'll do exactly what I was just talking about, which is okay, we don't like that the text on these is just bumping into the very sides of the containers, so we're going to add a little padding. Whoops, what did we do? Now our text looks really nice, but our column's gone.
You know, and that's exactly what happened to me all the time. And I was fiddling around with it. Okay, 1% less.
Yeah,
That
you
was
get
exactly what happened. Wow.
you get crazy when you're trying to do that, and it keeps falling.
Thanks for asking.
So when we apply box sizing, we say border box. Look at that. We get our column back. Basically what's happening is it's saying, factor that 20 pixels when your browser, please factor that 20 pixels on each side into the calculation of how wide this column should be. So that's like a really awesome trick. If you have questions about the syntax for that, by all means ask, and there's also a full reference, as I said, in the link that John sent out earlier today on, I think, like page 14 of that tutorial or something. But this is awesome. I use this on everything. Be wary. It doesn't work in, like, if you go to work, any of you go to work for like Fidelity and you need to support like computers that were built in 2000 and have never been updated, it won't work on Internet Explorer like 6 or anything like that. You need a semi-modern browser to be able to take advantage of this, because apparently nobody thought that this was an important thing until recently, but I think it's fundamental.
Can you? I don't understand what it's really doing.
So maybe it will help to open up the inspector. It might. But let's see. So when you look at kind of what I've done here, I've added this 20 pixels of padding to the left and right side of each of these columns. And when I don't have this here, more or less what's happening is, as we look at our kind of numbers of what the, it's saying this is 23% wide, but when it says it's 23% wide, what it really means is that the actual content region, this little portion, is 23% wide. That padding's not included in that. So then we say we have margin right of 2%, this content region's 50%, and then we've got the same thing over here. So percentage-wise, based on width and margin, we have a total of 100%, which would otherwise work, and it was before. But then we didn't take into account, we've thrown it all off by adding that padding. So now it's like 100% plus 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120 pixels extra. So what Border Box does is basically say to the browser, now what will take up 23% is the whole thing, including the padding.
Okay.
Does that make some sense?
Yeah.
It's a pity that padding should be included in the width.
Yeah, this should be the default behavior of CSS.
This is crazy. Why? I mean, you have margin. Okay, I see that, but why is padding not included?
This should just be the way that CSS works. Period. And almost everyone at this point is in agreement on that. And there are people, myself included, who start writing. By the way, you can apply this at the top level of your document, or to the top level of your style sheet, so that you never run into that issue again, by doing what I'm about to show you. This asterisk just says apply this to literally everything on the page. And you can do that, and that's what I do at the beginning of any project that I don't need to support older browsers on. That officially releases me from ever having to deal with that on that project. But that's a very common pitfall, so I'm glad you brought that up. That's a.
You said you only apply them on projects you know that you wouldn't have to deal with older browsers?
Right. The problem is the fallback is really crappy. For if you look at this in an older browser, the fallback would be it doesn't work and your column falls. So it's basically there's no like.
Yeah.
Just choose
and
another target audience.
There are some people who literally say that. We don't care. If you're going to come to us in Internet Explorer 6, you can find the sidebar down at the bottom of the page, guys.
You shouldn't work for
So
a retirement home. I don't know.
So, are there any other box sizing options?
Content box and border box, that's it. Content dash box is the default value. You would never set that on anything unless you are literally negating having previously set border box. But just so you're aware of it, content box is the other value. So if there's no more questions on that, anyone have more
I
questions?
have one more question.
Sure.
Do you use that asterisk for anything else?
Very limitedly. It's really a scary thing. It's like, do this to every single thing on the page. I'm trying to think of other instances that I might use it. The only other time I think I've used it, which I later found out you can do it on the whole body tag, is there's a property that allows you to set what type of font smoothing you want to use, which is a really kind of advanced thing, but I used to work for a typography company, so they were very picky about font smoothing, so I just kind of go in with the asterisk and say, make everything smooth and pretty like they want it, and just kind of do it all in one swoop, and then again I realized that could just be set on the body tag and it would cascade down, and that was much nicer. But no, there's really very few other instances where I would apply something to the whole page that way. Because if you apply it to if it's something that goes, trickles down, which box sizing doesn't, but if it's something that trickles down to child elements, you can just apply it to the body tag and then override it on anything later. Any other questions?
I think at one point during the positioning we were talking about like icons. So like let's say if I want to set up icons, what's the best positioning to use for that? Was that position relative or absolute that you guys recommended?
Icons in what context?
So let's say like when we were building profiles, some of us use an icon so that we can use like profile images as icons for like our name and location, and then like a diploma to represent like our educational background.
So in other words, the icon kind of sits to the left, and then there's maybe a heading or some text over to the right.
Yeah.
There's a few ways you could achieve that, but I would say definitely don't want to do like a position absolute in most cases unless you know that whole unit, that whole piece that you're building is never going to change in size whatsoever.
Yeah.
Because the problem that I'm going to show with that position absolute in a little bit is that as soon as you move to a fluid layout of any kind, and that means the size of anything involved is changing, position absolute can throw you way off because you're setting hard values for where the thing is.
Okay.
I'd say that generally you could either float that icon or image to the left, or you could do just a display inline block.
Okay.
Those would be the two ways that I would generally approach it.
Okay.
That make sense?
Yep.
Anyone else?
And would you embed the icon in a div? Or?
It depends. Yeah, if it were an image, I would probably put it in a div just set. You can actually set display inline block directly on an image as well. Either would work, but in a lot of cases, there's an advantage to putting it in a div because it allows you to, like in some cases, you want to kind of encase that sort of icon or set of icons in an outer border. Or there's other benefits.
Mm-hmm.
For the most part, if
the
all you're
positioning maybe.
Yeah, but if literally all you're looking to do is just move it to the left and have it float there, you could actually apply display inline block directly to an image. So this is fluid stuff I put together, and this kind of shows you what happens to this layout as it scales down. And I'm going to show you versus. I'm actually going to take out the media query for a second so that I can show you kind of where our original work, where our original layout fails. Looks great right here. Well, I mean, it looks a little wide, but it looks generally fine, right? Well, what if this were a website that was pretty rich in content? We have a ton of stuff here. We need to fit our navigation over there. We need to fit some stuff over here. And we start sizing this down. Eek. Now this little navigation bar, picture this on an iPhone. Picture this, the size of this. That little navigation bar would take up about this much space. So clearly this is not a sustainable layout for mobile. And this is the type of stuff that we started talking about with the mobile first kind of concept the other night. how would we think about this mobile first? What do we want to happen? We probably don't want columns, right? Because that's not going to be sustainable. We're not going to be able to fit anything in multiple columns on a mobile layout. So that's kind of one of those things where we say that the columns are actually kind of an addition, a thing that we want to add on to the layout once we've gotten beyond a certain size of browser. So, in other words, maybe I find when I get to, and it gives up this is a nice little thing of CodePen. Tells me exactly how wide my window is. Maybe I decide that it's right around here, right around when I get to 800 pixels that I feel like I could now accommodate these 3 columns. Otherwise, maybe what I want to happen is just my navigation to come first so that people can find content as soon as they arrive at my site. And then maybe the actual content region will live below. And maybe the stuff that I put over here in this sidebar is just some extra links or more reading that relates to whatever lives over here. So that's less important. It can float down to the bottom. I shouldn't say float because it won't actually be floating, just not to confuse anyone. So what we'd want to do in that case is this is kind of all the code right here, and I had it in Media Query, and I'm going to put it back in to show you what it looks like. Anything before here is basically just setting up our fonts, our colors, our text alignment, and then giving that, making that container with this dark gray background, some padding, the background colors for these. This stuff, anything south of here, is where I start floating stuff, setting column widths and percentages. The stuff that's giving us, this is all the stuff that's giving us this side-by-side layout. So thinking about this mobile first, what we really want to say is that all of that stuff, we only want to happen when it's a minimum width of 800 pixels. And so if we encase everything related to the columns like this, inside that media query, and I'll scroll back up to it just so you can see the syntax a little bit. Then what happens when we scroll down, or reduce the size of the window, is that. Once we get below 800 pixels, we get this nicely stacked content. It looks pretty ugly right now because there's nothing in it, but imagine a few navigation links here, imagine your bulk of your content here, and then those extra things float down to the bottom. That's probably how you'd want, naturally as you're scrolling through on a mobile device, that's about how you'd want it to behave. And when you think of that, on this, that seems like a much better experience. But then when we come up here, beyond that, 800 is called a breakpoint. When we go through that breakpoint up above 800 pixels, we're now getting that multi-column layout. A lot of people do tons of cool stuff with this. Many truly responsive websites have 5 or more breakpoints in there where they're saying, all the way down from your smallest phone to, maybe a couple more features for a larger phone like this, especially turned into landscape view, to a couple more, things that we can fit on a small iPad or something like that, going all the way up to like a 27-inch iMac or big desktop display. They introduce more features. They change the text size subtly to be a better reading experience because, there's various studies about, think about this, the distance that you normally use your phone, what's that about? They say about 12 inches from your face is where you use your phone versus where I use my computer, which is more like 18 to 24. So doing some text size adjustment, all kinds of different stuff that just kind of subtly refactors the experience for the type of screen that they think you're probably on at that size. So it's cool stuff. And we'll definitely be doing more of a deep dive, including probably what John will be talking about too, into responsive. But that's just like a little taste of how you could get into thinking about this in sort of a mobile-first type of way. Does anyone have any questions on that?
I have a question. When I see when you stretch the page that you apply 2% for the margin, and did you also apply 2% between the header and the container? Or
No. This is just this is the hard padding I set on the container. So it actually has a 20 pixel top padding and bottom padding. If we go down here.
So if you want to make sure that it's the same, the distance between the header and the container and between the blocks, you would have to use pixels, right?
If I wanted to make sure that
Mhm.
these vertical barriers were the
these and
same
those are
size
the
as
same.
this horizontal
Yeah.
barrier, you would have to use either pixels or some other, you can use, we'll get into like other units in CSS, I believe, at some point. There's M's, EMs, which are relative to the font size and all that. But yeah, you would have to set them in some absolute value, something that's not based on percentages or anything like that, because percentage height is different than percentage width and will behave differently. So,
Quick question. Did somebody else have a question? When you did the min width, right?
Mhm.
Does that mean we have to do another media query for max width? Like once it's below the 800 pixel width, right? And everything else fits differently, or will it automatically?
nope. So the idea of mobile first is versus traditional media query setup is this stuff. We start with the stuff that's how we want the mobile experience to occur.
Right.
So there's no need for anything that says max. So you're asking, would there be a need for one that says, like max with 799 pixels or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So no, we wouldn't need that because basically what it's outside the media query, we have everything to kind of set up our basic mobile layout, and then it says, okay, is the screen above 800 pixels? Also apply all this stuff. And then as you go down, you'd apply more stuff, the bigger and the bigger the screen gets. Whereas that's why they tell you to do it mobile first, because you can start with that do that building process. It's kind of like progressive enhancement, as opposed to is what the term is used for it, as opposed to like degrading the experience kind of by like going in, starting with your whole base style sheet that's based on a screen that's like this width or whatever, and then like saying, all right, set a max width media query and pluck this one thing out, set a max width media query and pluck this other thing out, like doing like your whole work based on this size of a screen, and then going in and selectively removing and diminishing the parts of the experience based on a reducing screen size.
So I guess if we're doing media queries, we're thinking responsive, we should think our priority would be min width rather than max width then, because if we're thinking mobile first.
Right. Min width is generally your and there are occasions for max width. There's you might want.
Maybe if you have an image, a background image, and you don't want it to blow up so.
Right.
So
So you
big,
could
I
say apply this certain image until the screen gets to this size, and then we decide at that point it's just too much. We don't want it, or there's certain edge cases, but.
Sure.
For the most part, the building process is min-width based. And that's kind of the practice that I like to use. Does anyone else have mobile responsive, mobile first type questions?
I have another question. I remember that we were working on one homework, and there was a button, and when I, reduced the width, I think we talked about it before, that it would break really funny, and I wanted the shape just to become longer, but there were two words in it, and it really looked weird.
Were they doing the thing where it's like click here and it goes click roll?
Yeah,
That kind of overlap thing?
yeah.
Yeah, I had that too.
So I think I can kind of picture what you're saying. All right, so it was one button, right?
Mm-hmm. And then I would, shrink the width, and there were two words in the button, and then the words would go down, but the shape wouldn't grow so that it would make a nice and even button. It was like they would like.
I'm guessing I'd have to see it to tell you for sure, but I'm guessing that would be related to some type of either floating or a constrained width problem where there's some extra padding, and so it's trying to resize it, but accounting for that padding, it's still too wide, so it's jamming stuff in. I'd probably have to take a look at it to tell you for sure exactly what's going on.
But if it was like an element within, let's say, the content, and I would move it, it would actually just make it higher.
Right. If you haven't adjusted anything to say otherwise, normally if I just had lines of text here or buttons or anything really, what would happen is as this got smaller, it would just all flow down naturally to absorb this, increase the height and absorb the space within the content.
Maybe I applied inline block or something. I can't
Yeah, there could be
remember.
there's a bunch of things
Yeah,
that can just
Okay.
inadvertently throw stuff off.
Okay.
Any other questions?
I felt like early on we went over how to go to top of page. So if you're building a mobile site and you want to, and like your regular site would be just one long site, but while you're mobile, you want to have the option to go to.
Individual sections.
Yeah. How would you do that?
That's a really good question. So, there's actually these types of links that are not outside the page that we talked about, like, I think for 2 seconds. But they're called content links. And the way they work is basically you can actually reference an ID, link to an ID. So, in this case, let's say, we can just say go up. And then what I need to do, so this is a link that we're just saying href pound nav. Looks pretty familiar, pound nav, right? That's what we'd actually put over here to reference an ID too, right? Is pound whatever the ID name that was set up is. So that's actually similar to how this works. So what we need to do is just apply an ID within the page with that name, nav. So now what this does is this has just built a link that links to this, to the header. And the same concept could work in reverse. You could link to something that's the footer, and I'll actually do that as well because that's a pretty good example. So now what happens, if I'm kind of scrolled to the middle here, and I click go up, it takes me up to the top. Oops, I'll have the text the same. This one's not go up, that one's go down. And if I click go down, it takes me to the footer. Up, down, in between. And you can apply that to, a common practice is to apply these IDs to each heading within your content. So you might have an article that's like 4 paragraphs long and each paragraph has a heading. You might apply an ID like that to each heading, and if that's part of your navigation system, and then within your navigation system, you just link to each of those IDs like that. So then someone could immediately land on your page, click one of those links, and hop down to that very part of the content.
Cool.
And there's a few different names for those. Some people call them content links. Some people call them like interpage links, or I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I'll find an article on those for you, but yeah, that's a really important thing to know about actually.
So can you go back up to what you wrote as the ID?
So I
How
just
did you
wrote,
get there?
here I wrote footer, and here I wrote nav, which is actually wrong, it's the header, but, and then I just referenced them with pound and the ID name.
So what? Go ahead.
Could you also just do equals header? Or do you
Equals-
have to,
no, you
can
have
you
to- in
only
this case-
target
In
the,
this case, you have to use an
name.
ID. it has to
an
be an
ID
ID.
name? Okay.
Yep.
So not okay.
So when are IDs used? Like
For this type of linking within a page, for styling that you want to be careful only will ever apply to one thing on a page.
Oh right.
That's about it. It gets useful as we get into JavaScript too. Targeting stuff by ID is generally good practice when you know that you only want that behavior on one element. It's a system that basically exists for any occasion when it's appropriate to have an element that's only ever going to exist in one instance on the page. So, you would never let's say there should be only one container on the page, and I want to make sure of that because I've applied some crazy styling to the container, and if I start calling other stuff container, I know it'll screw up my whole page. You know, I can do an ID called container, apply that to the div that I use, and I'm going to think twice before applying another ID called container because I know that an ID should only ever be used once, and it in fact won't allow you to use it more than once on a page and won't apply the styling correctly. So
Do we use classes in JavaScript also?
you can use classes in jQuery, and you will get into how to use them in JavaScript, but it's a little more complicated. It's actually what you have to do with that. Instead of get element by ID, we do get elements by class name, but you'd think that would spit out more or less a similar type of thing, right? Here's the thing or things that you want to operate on, but those things in JavaScript, there's not just a concept of a bunch of things strung together, so it actually puts them within this wrapper thing called an array, which we'll get into kind of how you work with that. There's an extra step that you need to go through once you've gotten that stuff back from get elements by class name and given it the class name. It comes back with this array of stuff. And then we have to figure out how to go through each thing in that and do whatever we want to it. So that's something that John's going to cover next week. It's not. And actually, I think Lisa was talking about trying to cover that tonight, so you might pop in there too after and see whether she has a code gen of that or anything. But let's put it this way: when we get into jQuery, everyone's life's going to get really easy. All of a sudden, you're like, why isn't JavaScript just like this? You can just type in $, parentheses, quotes, dot class name, just almost like in CSS, like here, basically uses that type of targeting system within a little wrapper, and it allows you to just operate on those things. It's really beautiful. So your lives will definitely get a lot easier when we get into that. We just show you that you should know JavaScript before you jump into jQuery, because otherwise something will go wrong with jQuery one day, and you'll be like, so how does this thing that I'm building actually work? How does this? What is jQuery doing right now that it's failing to do? Why is it breaking? So you kind of need to understand what's under the hood to then build upon that and understand jQuery. But it's definitely, I know very few sites that don't use jQuery at this point. Anyone else have questions? All right. There's only one more thing that I wanted to kind of go over with you guys, which is that little layout that we did, the little 3-column like this thing. Why wouldn't we use position absolute? Anyone have guesses why we would not want to do, and this is a layout executed in position absolute. One of the problems here, I might give you a hint of why we might not want to use it, but we could actually correct this particular problem.
Because it would stick somewhere, and if the others move, it's just weird.
Exactly. So there's two things that it will do. Just like floating.
Are those floating?
No, they're position absolute.
And that's footer?
That's the footer under there. So what's happening there is position absolute takes the thing and kind of plucks it out from the flow of the page, just like float does. Except float has this really cool feature called clear. Position absolute doesn't have clear. You can't say, all right, I'm done position absoluting now, put everything else beneath that. It doesn't work like that. Position absolute means you know that you have vacant space on the page ready to be filled right at the exact coordinates that you specify with that thing. So the problem here is we haven't made any vacant space for these columns to occupy. So we can actually do that really easily by just going up here to our container and defining a height on it so that we give it a little space to work in. So that solves one problem if we know that the content is only ever going to be 400 pixels high. But what happens if our content becomes 500 pixels high or 600 pixels high? Then we get that same problem again. That's problem one. That's just getting started. Then there's the fluid problem. We have this wrapper that I've fixed the width to 960 pixels on. What happens if this now needs to become a responsive layout? If we remove that, we see we got problems. It's just kind of sticking over there to the side, and that's because I hard-coded each of these widths, because that's how I would need to do it to work in a position absolute way, except that if I start to change these to percentages like I had them in the other layout, you see they're now, because I have them positioned based on the hard values that I had given them before, they're now starting to bump into each other again and do weird things that we don't like. So in general, position absolute can become like this really tempting tool when you first get into CSS, because it's like you get so aggravated playing with floats and inline block and all this position relative, and you're tweaking and tweaking and tweaking, and you can't get anything exactly where you want it. And you're like, but position absolute, I can just put it there. I can just press the button, say I want it at 100 pixels from the left side and 100 pixels from the top, and it's there. And it is. Except that the second that anything else around it changes, you no longer want it there. So the cases when it's appropriate to use position absolute, and remember that position absolute is relative to the first thing above it that has position relative applied to it. So if I applied position relative to this container, which I believe it did, position relative would be relative, to this container. If I did not, it would become relative to the entire body. So that can also be a little disconcerting. But position absolute has very specific uses, usually when you're kind of doing some type of very static layout. Like if I did some little decorative icon thing that always stayed the same, and I was kind of doing it with a bunch of little dots in CSS, I might say, all right, well, this thing is always going to be 100 by 100, and I never want any of these dots to move. So I might position absolute those within it because it's very static like that. But anything that's ever going to resize, reflow, anything, you get into danger zone with position absolute. So that's just something to be aware of. Does anyone have questions about that?
We only need the position relative with absolute. We don't need it with the floats. We don't have to give the
You don't
container
have to,
float,
no.
A relative position.
Yeah, no, you
When
don't
we
have to do
float.
that. The value position relative can provide on anything, and you can apply it to literally anything on the page. Is that, by default, it just does nothing other than provide a context for anything within it. So in other words, applying position relative to that outer div doesn't really do anything here for us except say that these inner divs are now positioned in relation to that. But it gives us the ability to now start providing top values and left values. So we can just nudge stuff with position relative. And that's why position relative is really nice. You can just say, oh, well, that needs to go 100 pixels down. Well, let's nudge it. And that's a much better way to think about things than position absolute, is trying to use relative positioning to kind of nudge and adjust things as you need to kind of achieve the layout that you're looking for. And then, usually when you test that and scale it up and down and have things reflow, it behaves a lot more nicely because position relative doesn't rip it out of the flow of the page, if you will. Meaning, if I have some text here, and I just say that there's an image in line with that text, and I make that position absolute, the text is just going to flow right under that image, which is not what we want. But if I make it position relative and just move it 10 pixels to the right, it won't do that. It will retain its original place on the page, and text will flow around it, as we would expect. So that's just like one of the many benefits of using relative as opposed to absolute in that type of a case.
So it sounds like we kind of want to avoid it.
Yeah, there's very, very specific cases where it is the right tool to reach for, but I'm just offering this kind of PSA to say don't do what I did when I first got into web design and be like, but come on, we can just put it, like I said, we can just put it there. It is a tempting tool to reach for, but know that even if it's not going to kick you in the butt now, it's probably going to kick you in the butt a week from now when you need to update something on that page and you're wondering why that one box just won't move or reflow the way you want it to. I'm trying to think of like a good analogy for this. I like cheesy analogies, but you basically glued it here. You can't move it. Everything else is a post-it note, and you've glued one thing right here. Without doing a lot of work, you can't move that one thing, even if you want to rearrange everything around it, So.
I forget, with
absolute things, do things go on top of them, or does it push
They
everything
generally
down?
go on top of other
Okay.
things. They generally will come up a layer and sit on top of other things, unless you specify otherwise. You can do z-index, which will move
Okay.
things up or down. The higher the number, the higher the order, so it sits on top.
Okay.
What you just did here, Brandon, with the position relative at, the top 100 pixel, is that better than giving it a margin of a top margin?
It's not better. In this case, it achieves the same result. There's some instances where margin just doesn't achieve the appropriate result. For whatever reason, there's some things, in one case is when you have a heading that has a margin on the bottom and then another paragraph below it, you want to add some margin to the top. What actually happens is that margin doesn't do anything because margin can flow into one another. So if I've got 30 pixels on the bottom of this heading and I want to add 10 pixels more, doing margin on the top 10 pixels won't actually do anything. But if I do position relative top 10 pixels, it will move it down. The only thing to be mindful of with position relative is that unlike adding margin, it doesn't actually nudge everything else down accordingly. So in other words, what I mean by that is, where's our footer? We didn't apply a position relative to our footer and nudge it down, so it basically, when you use position relative, the browser doesn't know that it's somewhere different than it was originally supposed to be. It still thinks it's up here in some level of its mind. We're just visually saying display at 100 pixels lower. So in that case, margin would actually be better if we want to avoid that type of a situation. So this would actually be the worst solution, but it's just kind of where you're using it and how you're using it. If you do one of those types of things, like there's this common graphical effect where like sometimes an image is somewhat overlapping, there's some text kind of just touching the corner of an image and maybe that first letter is a different color or something. It's like, usually on publication sites or whatever. That would be something that you would use position relative with the image for, to just kind of nicely tuck it up and under that text without it kind of wanting to reflow the text around it. But on the other hand, if you were kind of wanting that image to float, and create like this space for itself and have the text just kind of nicely flow all around it, not touch it at all, that would be something where you would just use some margin to give it a little space around the side.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have questions? All right. Does anyone have more general things or new topics that they want to cover in CSS and positioning related stuff, or do you feel like you generally got a good handle on the questions that you had?
I have one thing, but I could also do that at home, that I just started with input tags. Is there maybe something what's important to know about them, how to style them, how to, like the buttons and
To style them, the only thing that I would want to make you aware of
radio buttons.
is that outline is a thing. Outline was the biggest thing that tripped me up when I first started styling, like especially buttons.
Mm-hmm.
They get that kind of weird, in certain browsers, they get that weird blue glow coming out of them when they've been pressed.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me a while to realize that that's outline. That's a property that you can just say outline none. That gets rid of that annoying thing.
Oh, okay.
As far as working with them in the HTML side, you can apply an attribute called placeholder, which looks like this. I'll make one.
Can I get a water?
Sure. It's seltzer, is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine, thanks.
So on our mangled page here, I just put a sample text input. This shows you how you can actually apply a placeholder, and that's just what makes this little grayed out text in there that allows you to, you might specify, rather than putting, old school forms always had, like, they would have a label here that would say name, but instead now you can do placeholder, name, and then it says what it is, what you want to put in there, right there, and then as soon as you start typing, it gets rid of it. So that's a nice little thing to know about. And again, that horrid blue thing that we're seeing orbing out of that is the outline that I was talking about that you can get rid of.
And if you were adding the name or address or whatnot, like above it or under it or right next on the right hand side next to it, would you put that within a div to make it a group, or give it a label tag, or
It would be a
what
label.
would you use?
I would use it's called a label tag is what I would use.
So label, input, and then just write.
Yep, label, input, keep going with that. Some people like to nest their inputs within labels. What that allows you to do, there's two ways you can actually make a label correspond to a form input and actually make it so that when you click that label, it focuses into the field for that form element. One is by specifying label for equals, so like, I'll do it for this one. Two ways. One would be label for equals name, like that. And then what we have to do, that for corresponds to an ID. So we put ID name. So now when we click that, it should focus us into that name field. Or to avoid doing that, what some people like to do, I don't like to do it because it kind of, if I start styling the label, it kind of throws things off a little bit in my opinion, but some people do this. They actually nest the input right inside the label tag, and what that allows you to do, there you go. That way it still works, even without applying and doing the for. And the reason is anything, basically the browser knows that any input within this label corresponds to that label itself. So when you click it, focuses it on it. Those are a few things that I think are really, like, kind of took me a minute to figure out when I started doing HTML forms. And
if you would give it, more space, the name, name between the box, would you? How do you style it? How do you do that? Because you don't style the label. You don't.
In this case, I'd apply. Well, if I wanted to do it for all inputs, I could just target the input tag, but keep in mind that targets every type of input. Or I could apply a class to this and put but either way, I'd put some margin on the input field itself.
Oh, okay.
And you can actually show you something you can do.
So you wouldn't like create a new input from.
This is actually valid in CSS to write, to target something in these square brackets, target an attribute within the HTML. So in this case, we're saying only target the inputs that are text.
Okay.
That allows us to do 10 pixels. And to have it not work. No background. Red. Is it actually giving the style, or did I write this wrong? May not need these quotes. I'll have to figure out the syntax for that, what I'm doing wrong. But that is possible to do something like that where you actually target all the text inputs on the page. So that's generally how I go about styling forms.
Thank you.
Anyone else have questions? Sweet.
That's
All right.
great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
Sorry, you guys, for the technical difficulties at the beginning.
Okay,
Um,
can you just?
Oh, sorry. I'll leave this up for a minute. I'm gonna go check in with those guys and see what they want to do, how we want to all float around. But I'm also gonna get it folded.